Okay, hi everyone. I'm Ayman. I'm from Pakistan. I'm speaking on the behalf of the student paper of Lahore University of Management Sciences, also known as LUMS, and I'll be referring to my university as LUMS now. I'm really excited to be here with all of you and to share stories from my university and also hear about your universities as well. Presentation structure includes first the initial issues that students faced when online classes started, and then it'll be divided into three subcategories: resources, interconnectivity, and student-teacher partnership. So a little context before we dive in. LUMS is one of the highest ranked universities here at Pakistan. So it's actually home to students from all over this country, from various different backgrounds. And we also have some international students here. So alums, all of us have access to the same kind of resources. But when the university went online and the campus was closed, an imbalance occurred and our resources were no longer equal to each other. And I'll explain how that was so. So the biggest issue that students faced was Wi-Fi connectivity, because infrastructural development is not uniform in different parts of Pakistan. And even actually within the same city, some students would not be able to join class or would have to deal with constant buffering. And it became really difficult to meet deadlines. So we had cases here where the students would be attempting quizzes, but when they would be done and they would press submit, the site would just crash or would not load anymore. And so their answers wouldn't go through and they wouldn't get the grade at the end. And when we also had cases where Wi-Fi signals only come at certain points in the day. So what this was actually doing was that students had to change their entire routines according to signals availability. And student learning generally became really inconsistent within the same classroom. It was really difficult for teachers to take all of us at the same pace, and grading became perhaps a much bigger priority than learning during the pandemic. Next, we have workspace issues. So on campus, we had large lecture rooms where everyone was coming in to focus in on the same course material and engage with that. We had a library and labs and discussion rooms where there was furniture and atmospheres that were ideal for studying. And then we also had huge gardens where we could just go walk around, meet friends, and relax. But at home, most of us didn't have that. At home, family life and school life was starting to get intermingled, and it became really difficult to balance the two. There wasn't proper desks and seating arrangements for some, or even a separate room to study in peace. So what was happening because of this was that new distractions were coming in for students that they hadn't faced before. And this time there wasn't a proper space for de-stressing. So, student mental health was getting really affected. Physical health was getting affected. And then that curiosity that you find within an actual classroom to, learn something new, that wasn't getting sustained within the virtual classroom. And then on top of all of that, the situation was new to both teachers and students. So, teachers were just trying to make do. They were adding new assignments or deleting things from the course outline. And it was overall, students were just thrown into this atmosphere that was uncertain, unequipped, and just unprepared. And for the first time, teachers weren't ready. And that was something that students weren't used to. So I guess with this, it's a time for both teachers and students to think about the kind of expectations they have from each other and whether they need to reconsider those expectations. Resources. So over here, I'll talk about what kind of resources were being made available to students within the virtual classroom. How are teachers communicating course-related information to students? So at LUMS, teachers were using video conferences as one of the biggest means of communication to relay not just lecture material, but also relay expectations and deadlines and assignments. And so we were using the same kind of platforms I'm sure you guys were also using: Zoom, Google Meet, Skype. Then another thing that teachers did was to create class groups on social media platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook for class discussions. So over here, I actually have a picture from one of my own class groups on Facebook for my anthropology course. And over here, each week we had to post something interesting that we found on the net that was related to our course. This could be an article, a movie, a podcast, song, anything really. And we just had to, engage with it critically. So over here, this is an article on how the youth uses humor as a huge coping mechanism for their lived realities and their changing times. And it generally debates about, what kind of humor is acceptable or inappropriate. And then with these discussion groups, what was happening was that besides making students come onto new platforms like Zoom, something that we weren't used to before, teachers were also reaching out to students on platforms that already were already on and were familiar with and were more likely to respond over there. But the downside of these two options, the discussion groups and video conferences, was that information started getting spread across many different mediums, and it was really hard to keep up for students. So the third option is something that tackles to this, and that is basically to use websites or apps that have, many of these features already integrated into them. So for example, Google Classroom or Learning Management System, also known as LMS. And so LMS is something that LUMS uses, and it's a site where teachers can post readings, post announcements or deadlines and grading sheets, and even hold quizzes and create portals for discussion. So you'll find everything under one tab. And then the kind of lectures that we were having, live lectures that I've discussed, recorded lectures, recordings of live lectures to cater to both students who were facing connectivity issues as well as people who could connect online. And discussion groups. And by the last one, I actually mean having an entire lecture solely take place on a social media platform. So for one of my own classes, a poetry class that I had, the teacher made a WhatsApp group, and she would send a voice note at the start of the class introducing the topic, and then we all had to engage with that by sending in our own voice notes. And this worked because, the class was a workshop course where we all had to engage with each other. But, with every method, there are plus points and, downsides to it. So I guess something that I would like you guys to focus on is how to read what kind of method is suitable for which discipline. Or should there be a standard that all teachers or all departments should follow? So what were some of the positive impacts of online learning in the pandemic? And I would say accessibility of information was the biggest thing. And what I mean by that is because teachers couldn't rely on in-class discussions to provide class content anymore. So for example, I have a screenshot over here from one of my own course outlines for a restaurant management course. And the teacher provided COVID-related readings that told us basically how to manage a restaurant and earn money within the restaurant industry while there is a disease going on out there. So, this is just knowledge that we were applying practically. And then other than that, guests were being called in, people who might not have otherwise been able to give us a lecture because of accessibility issues. So again, I have a screenshot of some of my own guest lectures, and this person, Rid Chapman, was actually an American architect who, from America, he gave us a lecture to us in Pakistan about, his stories as an architect working with different restaurants. And then also because recorded lectures were being posted online, an archive was getting created where information could be accessed again and again for greater clarity. And so information wasn't getting lost anymore, it was getting stored in one place. And then for the negative impact, I would again also say accessibility of information, because where on the one hand, we had new modes of transferring information, there were also previous ones that were no longer available to us. And by this, I mean the library was no longer available, labs, infrastructure, mostly free computers and Wi-Fi, good Wi-Fi. These kind of things weren't available for many of us. So the quality of research that was going on was getting heavily affected. And I'll talk about this later on. Okay, interactivity. So here I'll talk about to what extent is interactivity necessary and to what extent is it being implemented in the virtual classroom. So the main purpose, I guess, from that teachers have for making their classes interactive is to create a simulation of a real life classroom where students and teachers are both involved in a dialogue, but also students are involved in a dialogue with each other. So a lot of class content is coming out of those discussions, out of those different perspectives that are coming forward. So the main thing to think about here would be, is it really important to stick to the previous models of learning that we were used to before the pandemic? or do changing times call for newer models in accordance with shifting priorities or student issues that are coming up? So some ways that teachers are, trying to make their classes interactive over here at LUMS. So at the end of every week, after the recorded lectures are viewed, there is an optional live session that teachers conduct at the end of the week to deal with any questions that there may be. Some teachers start experimenting with online tools like the breakout room on Zoom, which divides an entire class into smaller groups for group discussions. And then the whiteboard and stylus option, which I've also posted a picture of from a course. And so with this, the teachers are just able to draw out concepts while they're explaining it to the students. So it helps students focus better. But then again, there are different reactions to these. Some think that these are great for discussions, but then some also think that breakout rooms, especially add to this pre-existing frustration. Social awkwardness comes in again within these smaller group settings, and that's something that you don't have to worry about in a full class. And then there's also the raise hand option on Zoom, which I'm sure you all are familiar with as well. And it's basically a simulation of the same class discipline that we have all seen before. Within our actual classes. And then a personal story that I'd like to share, because I thought it was really empathetic of the teacher, was that one of my own instructors actually got a package that their phone service was providing, and so this allowed them to have 10 students on call at the same time. So whenever he would be having his live lecture and there would be students who would have connectivity issues, he would just call them up so that at least they could still hear the audio while it was happening. Research work, and I talked about this before as well. So by research work, I mean group projects and senior projects and independent studies. So how are these being impacted? The problems that were coming up was immobility. So, because everyone was quarantining, site visits and field trips had to get canceled. And so those places and the people within those places could not be interacted with anymore. And then so research pools started getting restricted. You weren't having face-to-face interviews. You had to rely on your own social network online. And so many students had to rely on incomplete data that they were compiling over the year and just, create reports out of that pre-existing data. And then also authenticity of interviews was getting compromised because that space to build trust, that you have within face-to-face interviews, when you can read each other's body language, that wasn't there anymore. So some adjustments that were happening was that teachers started to lower weightage for projects so that the grade wouldn't be impacted that much. Group meetings started happening online over text or video conferences, and then interviews were also happening on Zoom. Research started becoming heavily online, more online than it was before. And so over here as well, I have a Google form that I made for one of my own projects, and I just sent this around within my own friend groups, and then they sent it forward to their own friends, and so that's how I built my research pool. But again, that was limited because of the kind of people I could reach. So just a quick summary of live lectures versus recorded lectures that we all go through, and so I wanted to touch upon that. Live lectures, within that, the pros would be, there's this obligation when the video is on and you have to meet your instructor within a certain time period. There's this obligation to come prepared and to do your readings and maybe participate more than you would. So, discussions are better this way. And then there's also this compulsion to take notes because that after this lecture is over, you can't access that information anymore. So with note taking, there's just better learning as well. And the cons would be, obviously, people with the connectivity issues can't keep up. And it's just hard to develop a routine in quarantine. And so, keeping up with lecture timings would be difficult. And a lot of the pros were actually dependent on whether or not the option turn off or on your videos were given to students. Because, most students tend to keep their videos off and zone out of the lecture. And then with recorded lectures, the pros are student convenience. Students can view the lectures in their own time. Teachers tend to go more in depth with the course matter during recordings. And then recorded live lectures cater to all kinds of students, like I talked about before. And the cons would be that students are learning in an isolated space, and it's difficult to communicate. You have to rely on, when the teacher would see their email or their message. And there's generally privacy concerns that come up when you want to record a live lecture, because sometimes the subject of the lecture would be sensitive or controversial, and it would just get difficult if it goes out. So the question here would be, should more options be given to students, or would that just lead to further procrastination and fatigue? And, generally, how much do students actually care about interactivity in the pandemic? So lastly, I just wanted to talk about something interesting that was happening at LUMS called the Student-Teacher Partnership. So it was actually called Pedagogical Partnership Program, and this was an initiative that a part of LUMS called LUMS Learning Institute started. And LUMS Learning Institute basically focuses on enhancing teaching and learning communities at LUMS. So this partnership actually brings on students as co-partners in course design and pedagogical research. And the benefits of this for teachers is that they get vital feedback, student feedback, since students are at the receiving end of that course material. So the student perspective helps bring innovations to course design and course delivery, and just to make assessment methods more effective. And this happens by student partners sitting in the lectures and taking notes and then providing that feedback at the end of the class, or by students acting as mediators and reaching out to other students in the class. And then the benefits for students in this project is that they get to work at a collaborative level with teachers without that teacher-student hierarchy in between them. And the biggest incentive, I guess, would be that they get paid every month for this. And then so the project started during quarantine in the summers when instructors were redesigning their course outlines. And right now, partners were called in for 8 projects or 8 courses. And these were a diverse range of disciplines, from writing people's history to civic and global engagement to feminism and law in Pakistan, to computers, to accounting and finance. And so people with different skill sets and different sets of knowledge could apply for this. And just lastly, a few questions I would like to leave you guys with, and hopefully we can talk about this within the Q&A, is that, are student-teacher partnerships operating at your universities? And even if they are not, what kind of change can you expect within the classroom because of these partnerships? So I really hope this presentation was valuable to you in any way. I hope there were some takeaways that you had.